My name is Caroline Ann Bishop. I'm 32 years old. On December 19th, 2024, my mother called me and asked me to come home for Christmas. A real family Christmas, she said. Just us. I drove 14.7 miles from my one-bedroom apartment in Aurora, Colorado, to my parents' house in Cherry Hills Village, the one worth $2.4 million that I would never be welcome to inherit. I walked into a house with the heat turned down and the lights off, and the only person in it was my grandfather, 83-year-old Walter Bishop, sitting alone at the kitchen table with his hands folded like he was waiting for a verdict. On the counter next to him was a note in my mother's handwriting. The good stationery, the cream-colored cards with a little embossed B in the corner that she only used for things she wanted to look important. You'll stay with Grandpa Walt through the 29th. There's a chicken pot pie in the freezer. P.S. Maybe this is good practice for you, since NICU nursing doesn't exactly pay the bills anyway. They were in Lisbon. Business class, my father, my mother, my brother Preston, the management consultant who had always, somehow, in every version of our family, been worth more than me. I didn't cry. I didn't call them. I had spent 32 years learning this exact lesson. I was the understudy daughter, the one you call when the real cast can't make it. They didn't know that my grandfather had been watching them do this to me for 3 decades. They didn't know what he had already decided to do about it. And when they landed back in Denver 10 days later, tan and rested off $61,000 worth of European luxury, what they walked into would cost them more than they ever imagined they had to lose. If you're new here, welcome. If you've been here before, you know how this goes. Stick around till the end, because this one has a turn in it that even I didn't see coming, and I lived it. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I read every single one. Let me take you back, because this wasn't one bad Christmas. This was 32 years of erosion, one missed event at a time, until there was nothing left of the ground I thought I was standing on. May 14th, 2016. My nursing school pinning ceremony at the University of Colorado. 4 years of clinical rotations, of falling asleep with a highlighter still in my hand, of eating granola bars and stairwells between shifts because I couldn't afford to lose the study time it would have taken to sit down for a real meal. 142 graduates in that auditorium. 140 had someone in the crowd. I sat in row 12, seat 8, by myself. My mother had circled the date in red on the kitchen calendar 3 weeks earlier. "Wouldn't miss it for anything, sweetheart," she'd said. At 9:52 that morning, my phone buzzed, a text. "Sweetie, so sorry. Preston has his final interview with Hargrove and Lynn today. We're driving down to Colorado Springs to be there for him after. So proud of you. Dinner's on us this weekend, promise." 90 seconds later, a Venmo notification. $75 from Marjorie Bishop. The note said, "Congrats, Care Bear!" $75 for 4 years of nights and weekends, for a degree I paid for myself with loans because my college fund had been quietly redirected in my sophomore year to cover Preston's unpaid summer internship in D.C., the one that would open doors. But somebody came. Grandpa Walt walked in 11 minutes before the ceremony started, wearing his gray suit from his own son's wedding in 1994. "Still fits," he'd say, and carrying a bouquet of grocery store carnations, $9.99, the sticker still on the cellophane. He sat down next to me and didn't say a word about the empty seats around us. He just reached over and squeezed my hand once, hard, like he was trying to press something into it. After the pinning, after they called my name and I walked across that stage and got my pin, We took a photo together, just the two of us, on a stranger's borrowed phone that I emailed to myself later. I posted it in the family group chat. My mother reacted with a single thumbs up. My father didn't respond at all. Preston wrote, "Nice! Sorry I missed it. Huge day for me too, LOL. Tell you about it later." But Grandpa Walt, when we posed for that picture, looked at me in a way I didn't understand yet. Sharp. Focused. Like he was writing something down in a ledger only he could see. Fast forward to March 3rd, 2020. My 28th birthday, and also the week everything in the world tilted sideways. I was working 16-hour shifts in the NICU at Denver Health, holding tiny, fragile bodies that weighed less than a bag of sugar, watching parents through a glass wall because visitation had just been restricted overnight, and nobody knew yet how bad it was going to get. I came home to my studio apartment at 11 that night, peeled off my scrub top in the hallway because I was terrified of bringing anything inside with me, and sat down on my bathroom floor, still in my sports bra, too exhausted to shower, and I called my mother. "Mom, I had a baby code today. I did compressions on something the size of my hand. I can't stop shaking." She cut me off before I finished the sentence. "Honey, I can't talk right now. We're on a call with Preston. His firm just told him he's on track for partner 2 years early. Can you believe that? I'll call you back tonight, okay?" She never called back. The next morning I got an email. A Starbucks e-gift card, $20. Subject line, "Happy birthday, Care Bear. Treat yourself." Preston was making $265,000 a year by then. I was making $61,000. But apparently I was the one who needed to be reminded to treat myself to a coffee. I took a screenshot of that email. I couldn't have told you why at the time. Some part of me already knew I'd need proof one day. Proof that this was really happening. That I wasn't the one being unreasonable. Thanksgiving, 2022. I called my mother on November 9th to ask if we were doing it at the house that year. There was a pause on the line, then, "Oh, sweetie, did we not tell you? We're flying out to be with Preston. He's doing this executive leadership intensive at Wharton. There's a whole family weekend built into it. You understand, right? It's a huge career moment for him." Preston already had an MBA. He was already a senior manager. He did not need an executive leadership intensive the way a man does not need a second yacht. But it was Wharton, so of course they went. They were gone 5 days. I invited Grandpa Walt to my studio apartment for Thanksgiving. All 490 square feet of it. I had never cooked a turkey before in my life. It came out dry, one side scorched because my ancient oven ran 50 degrees hotter on the left side than the right. We ate off paper plates on the pull-out couch because I didn't own a dining table. Grandpa Walt looked around at my burnt turkey and my box stuffing and said, "This is the best Thanksgiving I've had in 30 years, Carrie, because somebody actually wanted me here." I laughed it off, thought he was just being kind. He wasn't smiling. His face was completely serious, and there it was again, that look from the pinning ceremony. Sharp. Watching. Keeping a tally. I did the math once, on a slow shift, out of some grim curiosity. Between 2016 and 2024, my parents attended 0 of my life milestones. 0. In that same window, they attended 21 of Preston's promotions, firm galas, his son Beckett's birthdays, his MBA send-off, an award dinner from the Denver Bar Foundation, even though Preston isn't a lawyer, he just does their consulting work. 21 to 0. I stopped being angry about it somewhere in there, because anger takes fuel, and I'd run out. What replaced it was colder, quieter. Just an understanding of how things were, the way you understand that Colorado winters get dark by 5 o'clock. My boyfriend Nathan asked me once, in October, "Why do you keep answering when they call?" I told him because they were my family. "No," he said. "Family shows up. What they do is use you." I didn't argue with him. He wasn't wrong, and we both knew it. There's more I should probably back up and tell you, because none of this started in 2016. It started so much earlier that I honestly can't pinpoint the first time it happened, only the first time I noticed. I was 9 years old the first time I remember counting. Not money, attention. It was my school's science fair, 3rd grade, and I'd spent 2 weeks building a working volcano with baking soda and vinegar and red food coloring, painting the papier-mâché mountain myself at the kitchen table every night after homework. Preston, who was 11, had a travel hockey tournament that same Saturday morning in Colorado Springs. My parents drove down for his tournament. My grandmother, Grandpa Walt's wife, who I barely remember now except in fragments, the smell of her hand lotion, her laugh, came to the science fair instead, because somebody in the family had to, and it clearly wasn't going to be my parents. I won 2nd place in my grade. I told my mother that night at dinner. She said, "That's wonderful, honey," while helping Preston ice his knee, and never asked a single follow-up question about it. I was 13 the year I made the middle school honor choir. A big enough deal that they held the concert at the actual concert hall downtown, not just the school gym. My parents had tickets. They didn't come. Preston had a debate tournament final that same evening, and my father drove him 3 hours to Grand Junction for it instead. My mother stayed home with what she called a migraine, though I noticed, watching from the wings before the concert started, that she'd texted my father twice during what should have been the worst part of a migraine to ask how the debate was going. I sang my solo to an audience that did not include a single member of my own family. A friend's mother drove me home afterward and told me, kindly, unknowingly twisting the knife, "Your parents must be so proud of you." 16th birthday. I got my driver's license that same week. My mother's gift was a card with $40 in it and a note that said, "Drive safe, sweetie." Preston, turning 18 that same year, got a used BMW 3 Series, paid for outright. Because a young man needs to arrive places looking put together, my father had said at dinner, as though the two events, my learning to drive and Preston needing a status symbol, were somehow different categories of the same milestone, rather than the exact same milestone treated in two completely different ways. College acceptance letters came the spring I was 17. I got into the University of Colorado's nursing program, which at the time had one of the more competitive admission rates in the state for that specific track, something like 11%. I remember opening the letter alone in the kitchen because everyone else was at Preston's lacrosse banquet that night. I called my mother's cell to tell her. She picked up on speaker, clearly in a loud room, and said, "That's great, honey. We're just sitting down for the awards dinner. Can I call you back?" She called back the next afternoon, almost as an afterthought, and asked, "So, did you get in anywhere good?" As though I hadn't already told her the answer less than 20 hours earlier. I'm not telling you all of this to make you feel sorry for a version of me that doesn't exist anymore. I'm telling you because by the time I sat in that auditorium, alone at my nursing pinning ceremony in 2016, it wasn't the first time I'd sat somewhere alone waiting for people who weren't coming. It was just the loudest, most public version of a pattern I'd been quietly cataloging since I was 9 years old, without even realizing that's what I was doing. There's a particular kind of numbness that sets in after enough repetitions of the same disappointment. It stops feeling like grief and starts feeling like weather. You just check the forecast, see the same thing coming, and bring an umbrella instead of being surprised it's raining again. So when my phone lit up with Mom at 7:41 p.m. on December 15th, 2024, I should have known better than to feel the small, stupid flicker of hope that I felt. I should probably tell you how Nathan and I actually met, since he ends up mattering quite a bit to everything that happens later. We met in September of 2022 in the parking lot of Denver Health, of all places, at 2 in the morning. I'd just finished a brutal double shift, the kind where you lose track of how many alarms you've silenced and how many families you've had to walk through the worst night of their lives, and my Subaru wouldn't start. Dead battery in 22-degree weather, and I was standing there in my scrub jacket, close to tears from pure exhaustion, when a Flight for Life helicopter landed on the hospital's rooftop pad, and 20 minutes later, its pilot walked out through the same employee lot I was stranded in. He didn't ask if I needed help. He just walked over, saw the hood up, and said, "You want me to look, or you want to keep staring at it and hoping it fixes itself out of spite?" I laughed for the first time in probably 14 hours. He jumped my battery off his own truck, and instead of leaving once it started, he stood there in the cold and asked if I'd gotten dinner yet, at 2 in the morning, which I hadn't, obviously, and we ended up at a 24-hour diner near Colfax, splitting a plate of pancakes and talking until sunrise about nothing important and everything important, the way Grandpa and I would end up doing 2 years later by his fireplace. Nathan grew up in a small town outside Pueblo, the son of a wildland firefighter himself, and he understood something about my life that almost nobody else ever had. The particular exhaustion of a job where you give everything you have to strangers and go home to an empty apartment with nobody checking in on whether you're okay. He never once, in over 2 years together, made me feel like my career was a consolation prize compared to some more impressive version of a life I should have been chasing instead. He just seemed to think what I did mattered, plainly, without qualification, the same simple way Grandpa eventually did too. Sunday, December 15th, 2024, 7:41 p.m. I was at Nathan's place. He was making his grandmother's braised short ribs, the kind that take 4 hours and make the whole apartment smell like red wine and rosemary. We were supposed to have a quiet night in, maybe put on a movie, maybe just sit on the couch and not talk about work for once. My phone lit up on the counter. Mom. I almost let it go to voicemail. I never let it go to voicemail. "Hi, Care Bear." Her voice was different, soft, warm in a way that didn't quite match her. "I know this is short notice, but we would really love to have you home for Christmas this year. All of us together. It's been too long." I covered the phone and mouthed to Nathan, "They want me for Christmas." His eyebrows shot up. He knew the history better than anyone. "What about Preston?" I asked her. "Oh, he'll be there too, the whole family. Grandpa's been asking about you." That one caught me off guard. Grandpa never asked them about me. He called me directly, every Sunday at 6, like clockwork, to talk for 20 minutes about nothing. The ice on his driveway, my shift schedule, the Broncos game he'd fallen asleep during. If he wanted to see me, he picked up the phone himself. He didn't need my mother to relay it. Yeah, okay, I can come." I heard her exhale, relief or something close to it. "Wonderful. Come the morning of the 20th. We'll have breakfast, spend the whole week together. It'll be lovely." Then, almost as an afterthought, the way you slip a hard truth into a sentence you hope will slide by unnoticed, she added, "And honey, don't bring Nathan this year. Just family. We need to reconnect." Red flag. A giant, waving, floodlit red flag. I ignored it. because in my head, the words, "They want me home," were playing on a loop like a prayer I'd finally gotten answered. "Okay," I said. "I'll be there." After I hung up, Nathan set down his wooden spoon and turned off the burner entirely. Care. Think about the last time they invited you to anything without needing something from you first. "Maybe they've changed," I said. "Maybe people don't change," he said. "Patterns do, and their pattern is using you." I felt myself get defensive, protective of them even though they had never once been protective of me. "They're my parents. I have to believe them." "You don't have to believe anything," he said. "You choose to. Every single time." He was right, and I knew he was right, and I still couldn't make myself stop hoping. What I didn't know that night was that Nathan had been planning something of his own. I'd found the small black box tucked behind his winter boots in the hall closet 2 weeks earlier, reaching for a scarf. I'd seen the tabs open on his laptop for the Sculpture Park ice rink in Loveland. Dates, permit windows, something about string lights. He was going to propose on Christmas Eve. And I was about to cancel everything for a family that had never once chosen me first. I got in my car, a 2013 Subaru Outback with 171,000 miles on it and a check engine light that had been glowing steadily for 4 months because I hadn't had $600 free to deal with it. I took I-25 south to University, then wound through the gates into Cherry Hills Village, past the properties with their own names carved into stone markers, past the frozen ponds and the security patrol trucks that circled the neighborhood twice an hour. The drive took 26 minutes. Every station was playing Christmas music. I turned the radio off somewhere around Bellevue. Their house sat behind a wrought iron gate on Quail Hollow Court. 6 bedrooms, 5,100 square feet, worth $2.4 million, according to the county assessor's site, which I had looked up once, late at night, wondering idly what it might feel like to inherit something, anything, from anyone. The circular driveway was empty. No black Range Rover, that was my father's. No white Mercedes GLE, my mother's. No silver BMW X7, Preston's. Just Grandpa Walt's 2001 Ford F250 parked crooked off to one side, faded from navy to a chalky gray blue. 298,000 miles on it, a number he recited with more pride than most men recite their golf handicap. I sat in the driveway with the engine off and counted my own heartbeat. It was fast, too fast. Something in my body already knew before my brain caught up. I got out anyway. 10:22 a.m. I walked up and the front door was unlocked. "Mom? Dad?" Nothing. The house was cold. I checked the hallway thermostat out of habit. 63 degrees. They kept it at 74 when they were home. My mother hated being cold more than she hated almost anything. The foyer had a 9-foot Christmas tree done entirely in white and champagne gold, professionally staged, not a single ornament out of place. Under it, 16 wrapped boxes. I counted them later, standing there in my coat. 14 were tagged for Preston, Vanessa, and Beckett. 2 were tagged, "To Mom and Dad, from us, with love." 0 had my name on them. I walked through into the great room. The fireplace was cold, the ash inside at least 2 days old. No coffee smell in the kitchen, no dishes in the sink. The quartz counters were spotless in that particular way that means nobody has cooked in that kitchen in some time. And then I saw him. Grandpa Walt, sitting in the wingback chair by the bay window that looked out over the frozen fountain in the backyard, wearing his old flannel with the leather patch he'd sewn onto the elbow himself, khakis, and a pair of white New Balance sneakers that had to be from the early 2000s. He didn't turn when I walked in. "Grandpa." I came closer. "Where is everyone?" He turned his head slowly. There was no surprise on his face at all, like he'd been expecting this exact moment down to the minute. "Lisbon," he said, calm, matter of fact. "What?" "Lisbon, then the Amalfi Coast, then Santorini, I believe." He nodded toward the kitchen with one arthritis-twisted hand. "Your mother left you a note." The floor tilted a little under me. They're in Europe?" He didn't answer, just pointed again, and I walked to the kitchen on legs that had gone strangely numb. On the black granite island sat a cream-colored note card from my mother's monogrammed stationery set, the one that ran $40 for a box of 25. Her handwriting was that perfect, practiced piano teacher cursive she'd trained into herself as a girl, every loop identical to the last. I read the first line. "Care Bear, huge emergency, change of plans." Emergency. The word emergency, as though this were a crisis, as though Preston's firm flying his whole family to Europe for its 10-year anniversary retreat was something requiring urgent, unplanned action, and I was simply the solution to the inconvenient leftover problem they hadn't wanted to deal with. My brain refused to process it the first pass through. I read it again. "Care Bear, huge emergency, change of plans. Preston's firm is flying the whole family out for their 10-year anniversary retreat. All expenses covered. Isn't that incredible for him? We leave this morning. You'll stay with Grandpa Walt through the 29th. He needs his blood pressure meds twice a day. You're a nurse, you know what to do. There's a chicken pot pie in the freezer. We'll bring you back something nice from Portugal. P.S. Maybe this is good practice for you since NICU nursing doesn't exactly pay the bills anyway. Mom." I read it 3 times. The ink was fresh, no smudging, ballpoint pressed hard into the paper. I guessed she'd written it around 8 that morning, right before they left for Denver International. United Flight 998 to Lisbon via Newark, departing 11:40 a.m. I looked that up later, too. They hadn't called, hadn't texted, just a note on a counter and a closed door behind them. My hands should have been shaking. I waited for the tears, for the anger, for anything at all. Nothing came. Just a strange, spreading cold. I folded the note carefully and put it in my coat pocket, then walked back into the great room. Grandpa Walt still hadn't moved, still watching the frozen fountain outside. I looked up above the mantel. 3 stockings hung there in a neat row. Burgundy velvet with gold script, Dad. Emerald velvet with silver script, Mom. Navy velvet with gold script, Preston. The mantel was easily 7 feet long. There was room for a dozen more stockings if anyone had wanted to hang them. "They hung those Tuesday night," Grandpa said quietly without turning around. "December 17th, 2 days before they called you." 2 days before they invited me home. They had already decorated, already planned the whole holiday, already decided, silently and completely, who belonged in this house for Christmas. And I simply hadn't been on that list until they needed a solution to a scheduling problem. I stood there staring at that gap on the mantel where a 4th stocking could have easily hung, and I understood, all at once, that none of this had been improvised. The tree, the gifts, the trip, the note, it had all been arranged in advance. They just hadn't planned for me to be part of any of it. I was patched in afterward, like a temp worker called in for an overnight shift nobody else wanted. 10:31 a.m. Somewhere over the middle of the country, my family was settling into their business class seats with mimosas, heading toward Portugal. And I was standing in a $2.4 million house I would never inherit, with a man they had left behind like a piece of luggage too heavy to bring along. I pulled the note back out of my pocket and read it again, slower this time, word by word. You're a nurse. You know what to do. Using my career like a tool, like justification, as though 8 years of clinical training and a state license and my hands-on experience keeping the smallest, most fragile human beings alive existed for one purpose: so I could be unpaid backup labor whenever it was convenient for someone else's itinerary. All expenses covered. Isn't that incredible for him? 3 exclamation points worth of enthusiasm about Preston's trip. 0 about me staying with an 83-year-old man managing a cardiac medication schedule. Doesn't exactly pay the bills anyway. She'd underlined exactly. I hadn't caught that the first time through. The pen had pressed down harder there, a groove in the paper. Intentional. My mother had sat at that counter and deliberately written, in her own hand, that the work I did keeping premature infants alive through their first fragile weeks of life was somehow not a real accomplishment. Preston helped hedge funds restructure debt so they paid less in taxes. He made $265,000 a year. He was successful. I made $61,000 a year, holding tiny bodies steady through their first breaths of life. I was apparently a hobby. I opened the freezer. One item. A Marie Callender's chicken pot pie, family size, $7.49, the sticker still on it. That was the full 10 days of food they had left behind for a man in his 80s managing hypertension and a mild arrhythmia. I opened the refrigerator next. A half-gallon of 2% milk expiring in 4 days. A jar of dill pickles. 3 eggs. Nothing else. I stood there with the door open, cold air rolling out over my legs, and did the kind of silent math I would end up doing constantly over the next 10 days. "Grandpa?" I said, closing the fridge. "Did they leave your pills out anywhere, or are they in your room?" "Bathroom," he said. "Second shelf. I've been managing my own medications for 60 years, Carrie. I don't need supervision." "I know you don't." I sat down across from him at the kitchen table. "But I'd like to look anyway, if that's all right." He nodded, and something in his face shifted. Not gratitude exactly, more like he was filing away one more data point in whatever ledger he was keeping. That first afternoon, I drove to the King Soopers on University to actually stock the house. I spent $94 of my own money on groceries, real food, chicken breasts, vegetables, oatmeal, the low-sodium bread he needed for his blood pressure, a box of the peppermint tea he liked. When I came back, he was sitting exactly where I'd left him, watching the fountain, which had frozen solid days earlier and clearly wasn't going to thaw before New Year's. "You didn't have to do that," he said when I started putting groceries away. "I wanted to." "Nobody wants to spend their own money on somebody else's house," he said. "Not for real. Not unless there's something underneath it." I stopped mid-motion, a bag of rice in my hand. "There's nothing underneath it, Grandpa. You're my grandfather. I love you." He looked at me for a long moment, longer than was comfortable, the way you'd look at an X-ray trying to find the hairline fracture everyone else had missed. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, "Huh," and went back to watching the yard. That night I built a fire because the house still felt like it hadn't been properly warm in days, and we sat in the great room while I checked his blood pressure with the cuff I'd brought from my own supplies. 138/84, a little high but not alarming, and logged his evening dose. He watched me do it with an unreadable expression. "You do this for strangers," he said. "All day, every day." "I do. For babies who can't even say thank you." "They can't," I agreed. "Their parents usually do, though. Not always. Sometimes people are too scared or too exhausted to say much of anything." "And you do it for $61,000 a year." It wasn't a question. I looked up, surprised he knew the number at all. "Your mother mentioned it once," he said before I could ask. "In passing. The way you'd mention the price of gas." "It's enough," I said, which wasn't quite true, but felt like the right thing to say out loud in that house. He didn't respond to that. He just picked up his book, a battered paperback Western, the spine cracked from decades of rereading, and said, "Everything, Carrie, is about to be very okay." He said it like a promise, not a comfort. A statement of fact about something that hadn't happened yet, but that he had already decided was going to. I didn't ask what he meant. Some part of me, the part that had saved that note, the part that had been screenshotting things without quite knowing why for years, understood I was supposed to wait. So I waited. Nathan called that night at 8. I answered from the couch, the fire crackling low. "How's the war zone?" he asked, half joking, half not. "Quiet, actually. Grandpa's asleep. I got groceries." I told him about the note, read him the line about NICU nursing not paying the bills, and I heard him go very still on the other end of the line. "They left an 83-year-old man alone in a house with one frozen pot pie." "They left him with me," I said, which in their heads I think counts as the same as being fully staffed. "Care." His voice had an edge to it I rarely heard from him. "This isn't normal. You know that, right? This isn't a normal family thing." "I know," I said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I actually meant it when I said it, instead of just repeating the sentence like a line I'd been handed to read. Day 2, December 21st. I woke up in my childhood bedroom, which had been converted into a guest room years ago, my old bed replaced with a queen, my old posters and trophies packed into bins stacked along one wall, next to boxes labeled Preston, Law School, and Preston, Wharton, in my mother's handwriting. There wasn't a single box with my name on it anywhere in that room. I made coffee in a pot that looked like it hadn't been descaled since the Obama administration, and brought Grandpa a cup exactly the way he liked it. Splash of cream, no sugar. Something I only knew because I'd been paying attention for 32 years, while apparently nobody else in that house had bothered. We fell into a rhythm those first few days that felt almost peaceful, in a strange, quiet way. I did his laundry. I made sure he took his morning and evening doses. I checked his blood sugar because it turned out, something nobody had mentioned to me, that he'd been managing borderline diabetes for 2 years and simply hadn't told anyone except his primary care doctor. I cooked real meals. He talked, slowly at first, then more and more, about things I had genuinely never heard before. His childhood in Rifle, his years driving concrete trucks before he owned the company, the year my grandmother died, and how the house had felt too big and too quiet ever since. On the third night, December 22nd, he asked me a question that stopped me cold, standing at the stove with a wooden spoon in my hand. "If you could choose your family, Carrie, really choose, from scratch, would you choose them?" I didn't answer right away. The question sat in the kitchen like something with weight to it. "No," I finally said. My voice cracked on the word, which surprised me more than the honesty did. "Why not?" "Because they don't see me. I'm useful. I'm a backup plan. I've spent 32 years trying to earn something they were never going to give me. And what's that? His voice was gentle, but his eyes were doing that thing again, sharp, focused, taking notes. I had to force the next words out past something tight in my throat. Love. Respect. Just being wanted. For nothing. Not because I could do something for them. He nodded slowly, deliberately, like a man confirming a measurement he'd already suspected was true. Good, he said. Good that you finally said it out loud. Then, quieter. Truth's the first step. First step to what? He didn't answer that either. He just picked his fork back up and said, You'll see. Give it a few days. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in that room full of other people's boxes and thought about all the years stacked up behind me, the pinning ceremony, the birthday I spent crying on a bathroom floor, the Thanksgiving with the burned turkey that somehow ended up being the best one either of us had in years, Nathan's box hidden behind his winter boots, the proposal I was missing right now for a family who couldn't be bothered to leave more than one frozen pie in the freezer for their own father. And underneath all of it, one thought I couldn't shake. Grandpa Walt knew something. He was watching all of this unfold like it was a story he'd already read the ending of. December 23rd, day 4, gave me the one moment during that whole stretch where my training actually mattered in a way that scared me. I'd gotten into the habit of checking Grandpa's blood sugar before breakfast every morning, mostly out of an abundance of caution since nobody had briefed me properly on his diabetes management, and his own primary doctor's office was closed for the holidays. That morning, his reading came back at 58, low enough to worry me, especially paired with the faint tremor I noticed in his hands when he reached for his coffee mug, and the slightly glassy, distant look in his eyes that I recognized instantly from 100 other patients over the years. Grandpa, when's the last time you ate anything? Had a little toast last night, he said, which meant, doing the math, close to 14 hours had passed since he'd last put real food in his body, on top of a blood pressure medication that could compound the effect. I didn't panic. Panicking has never once helped a patient. In 8 years, I'd learned that lesson early and hard. But I moved fast. Orange juice first, 4 ounces. Then a slice of toast with peanut butter once he could hold a cup steady again. Then a recheck 15 minutes later. His number came back up to 84, still on the low side but climbing in the right direction. And I sat with him for the better part of an hour after that, monitoring, watching his color come back, listening to his breathing even out. You know exactly what you're doing, he said quietly, once the color had fully returned to his face. It wasn't a question. It's my job. No, he said. Your job is babies in incubators. This wasn't your job today. This was just you. Choosing to pay attention to an old man nobody else bothered checking on. He was quiet for a moment, watching me clean up the juice glass and the empty toast plate. Your mother's called that house 5 times over the years to ask about her own father's medications and gotten it wrong every single time. Wrong dosage, wrong timing. Once she genuinely thought I was on a blood thinner I'd stopped taking 2 years earlier. You've been here 4 days and you already know more about keeping me alive than she's learned in 83 years of being my daughter-in-law. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just kept cleaning the counter, and he let the silence sit there instead of pushing for a response. Later that afternoon, once he'd fully steadied, he told me for the first time about my grandmother's death, 11 years earlier, in a way I'd genuinely never heard before. Eleanor went in her sleep, he said. Pancreatic cancer, we'd known for 4 months it was coming. hospice at home the last 3 weeks of it. A nurse came twice a day toward the end, younger than you are now, I think. Kind as anybody I ever met. She held Eleanor's hand the morning she passed, because I'd stepped out to the kitchen for 2 minutes, just 2 minutes, and I missed it. That nurse told me afterward that Eleanor wasn't alone, not for a second. And I've thought about that woman more times over the past 11 years than I can count. I never even learned her last name. He looked at me then, and I understood, finally, all the way down, exactly why the photograph of the nurse in front of the rifle clinic had mattered so much to him, and exactly why caregiving isn't a real career had been the single sentence in that whole ugly note that had apparently cut him the deepest, even more than it had cut me. Christmas Eve, my phone lit up with a FaceTime call from Nathan at 7. I answered from the great room. Grandpa was in his chair with his book, the fire going. "Merry Christmas Eve, Care," Nathan said, his apartment visible behind him, the apartment I stayed at 4 nights a week that had slowly, quietly become as much mine as his, without either of us saying so out loud. "How are you holding up?" "Honestly, better than I expected to be." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Your mom texted me today, asked if I knew where to find good Portuguese custard tarts in Denver for when you got back. Apparently she forgot to grab you any in Lisbon." I laughed, but it came out sharper than I meant it to. "They're in Lisbon right now. They could buy them themselves and bring them home in a bag." "That's exactly the point, Carrie," he said. "They won't." Grandpa looked up from his book. I hadn't realized who was listening. After I hung up, he said, without preamble, "That's your young man?" "Yeah, Nathan. He flies rescue helicopters." "He loves you." "I know." "And he's right," Grandpa said, closing his book. "They won't bring you anything. They'll say the shop was closed, or they ran out of suitcase room, or they simply forgot. And they'll say it like it's a small thing, because to them, it is. I've watched them do this to you for 30 years, Carrie." I stared at him. You noticed? All this time?" "I'm old," he said, "not blind." Something in my chest went tight and hot all at once. My whole life I'd assumed I was the one being unreasonable, oversensitive, reading too much into ordinary family chaos. More than one well-meaning therapist over the years had gently suggested maybe I was projecting. Maybe I needed to examine my own expectations. But here was my grandfather, 83 years old, telling me flatly that he'd seen the exact same thing I had. I wasn't imagining it. It had been real the entire time. Christmas morning. No presents under the tree with my name on them. I already knew there wouldn't be, so it didn't land the way it might have a decade earlier. I came downstairs and made coffee. Grandpa was already up, sitting in his chair, and he held out a small envelope. "This is for you." Inside was a handmade card on watercolor paper. He'd painted something himself, in careful, unsteady strokes, an old truck, navy blue, with a single word underneath in his handwriting. Ours. Inside the card, more of his writing. "Carrie, thank you for being here. Not because they asked, because you chose to. Grandpa Walt." Folded inside was a $50 bill, worn nearly to cloth, a bill so old the paper had gone soft. I started crying, not because of the money, but because of the words. Because you chose to. Nobody in my entire life had ever thanked me for choosing them. Grandpa stood up slowly, wincing with the effort. His arthritis had gotten worse over the years, though he never complained about it out loud, and hugged me. We were not a hugging family. I couldn't remember the last time anyone in that house had embraced me like that. He held on for a long 10 seconds and whispered into my hair, "You're the only one who sees me as a person, not a checkbook." I pulled back. "A checkbook?" He heard himself say it, and something in his face closed like a door. "Nothing," he said. "Old man rambling." It wasn't rambling. It was deliberate. He was testing the water, seeing whether I'd push. I didn't push, not that day. But I filed it away, the same way I would later realize I'd been filing everything away for years without knowing exactly why. Later that afternoon, still on Christmas Day, I found a shoebox of old photographs tucked into the hall closet while I was looking for extra blankets, the cardboard soft and split at one corner from age. I brought it to Grandpa without asking, and he looked at it for a long moment before nodding, like he'd been waiting for someone to find it. We spent almost 2 hours going through it together. My grandmother, Eleanor, at 23, laughing on the tailgate of that same Navy Ford truck years before I was ever born. Grandpa in his 30s, dust-covered, standing next to a second concrete mixer with his arm around a man he told me was his first real employee, a man named Hector who'd stayed with the company for 31 years and whose funeral, Grandpa mentioned quietly, he'd been the only bishop to attend. My father is a toddler, sitting on the running board of the truck. A photo of me at maybe 4 years old, sitting on Grandpa's lap on this exact porch, a photo I had genuinely never seen before in my life, one he must have kept separately from whatever albums my mother curated for the rest of the family. "Why do you have this one?" I asked, holding it up, "and not in an album with everyone else's?" He looked at it for a long time before answering. "Because your mother never made an album with you in it, the way she did with Preston." His baby book filled 2 full volumes. Yours, I asked her about it once, years ago, and she said she'd gotten busy and never finished it past your first birthday. He said it without cruelty, just as a fact, the way you'd read off a weather report. I kept the ones with you in them separately because I didn't trust anyone else in this house to keep them safe. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just held the photograph a little longer than I needed to. We found one more that stopped me completely. Grandpa, younger, maybe 50, standing in front of a small building with a hand-painted sign that read, "Rifle Community Clinic," his arm around a woman in scrubs I didn't recognize. "Who's that?" I asked. "A nurse," he said. "Ran the only clinic in Rifle for almost 20 years, mostly for families who couldn't afford insurance. I helped her keep the lights on more than once, back before I had real money to speak of, long before the concrete company sold." He tapped the photograph gently. "I've always had a soft spot for people who take care of other people and don't get paid enough to do it. I suppose you can guess why." That was the moment, looking back, when I think I first understood that none of this, the careful attention, the quiet questions, the sharp, watching look he'd worn since my pinning ceremony, none of it was new. It had been building for years, decades even, long before I ever walked into that cold, empty house on December 20th. I had simply never had a reason to notice it until now. We sat by the fire that evening, me on the floor with my back against the stone hearth, Grandpa in his chair, both of us quiet in that comfortable way you only get with someone you've stopped performing for. Then, out of nowhere, he started talking about Bishop Ready Mix, the company he'd built from a single truck in 1962. "I bought that truck with money I'd saved driving somebody else's truck for 6 years, he said. "One truck, one crew, me and 2 other men. Your grandmother kept the books on a card table in the garage because we couldn't afford an office. I drove that truck myself for the first 11 years. "That's incredible, Grandpa." 49 years after that, in 2011, a company out of Denver offered me $28 million for the whole operation. I took it. He said it so plainly I almost missed the number entirely, and then it landed. I nearly spilled the mug of tea in my hands. $28 million? Your father thinks I spent most of it. Living expenses, medical bills, a little bit of charity here and there. He thinks I've got maybe $150,000, $200,000 left in savings. And he's been quietly worried for years about what happens when that runs out and I need help. Are you? I asked. Down to 200,000? He smiled, small, sharp, almost amused. No. My heart started pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I invested the $28 million conservatively, he continued. Balanced portfolio, mostly index funds and municipal bonds, some real estate. It's grown to just over $31 million. The dividends alone throw off close to $800,000 a year. I live on about $42,000 of that. Where does the rest go? Donations, anonymous mostly, scholarships for kids out of Rifle where I grew up, funding for the NICU wing renovation at Denver Health 3 years ago. He looked directly at me when he said that. Veterans housing. Nobody knows, not even your father. Why hide it? Because I wanted to find out who loved me for me, he said, leaning forward in his chair, his eyes steady on mine. Turns out only one person did. He was looking right at me when he said it. My hands had started to shake. My grandfather had $31 million, and my family had left him alone in a house with a single frozen pot pie and a note calling my career a hobby. Can I ask you something? I said, once I'd caught my breath a little. Why is Dad like this? He wasn't always this cold, was he? You must have raised him differently than this. Grandpa was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee mug slowly in his hands. I worked constantly when your father was young, he finally said. 60, 70 hours some weeks, building that company up from 1 truck to 40. I missed things. His Little League games, most of his school plays. One Christmas morning, entirely because a mixer truck broke down on a job site and I went to fix it myself rather than pay someone overtime on a holiday. I told myself it was for the family. I told myself I was building something for him to inherit one day. But he grew up believing that love looked like money and providing, and nothing else, because that's the only version of it I ever actually showed him. I taught him, without ever meaning to, that showing up in person mattered less than showing up financially. And then he grew up and did the exact same thing to you and Preston, except he had even more money to hide behind than I did, and even less excuse for it, because he never had to work 70-hour weeks the way I did to earn it. He inherited the habit without ever having to earn the sacrifice that used to justify it. He looked down at his hands. I've had a lot of years to sit alone in this house and think about that particular chain, Carrie. I'm not proud of my part in starting it. That doesn't excuse what he's done, I said quietly. No, Grandpa agreed. It doesn't excuse a single day of it. But I wanted you to understand it, at least, because understanding where a wound came from doesn't mean you have to keep bleeding from it. It just means you get to decide, with open eyes, whether you're willing to break the pattern instead of just inheriting it the way he did. We sat with that for a long moment before he spoke again. I need you to understand something, Carrie. What I'm about to do isn't about punishing them for being wealthy, or for having nice things, or even for going on that trip. It's about the fact that for 32 years, they've had you available, capable, loving. And they treated all 3 of those things like they were owed to them for free, and gave nothing back. That's the part I can't forgive. While those days with Grandpa passed in quiet routine, pills, meals, blood pressure checks, long conversations by the fire, my family was living something entirely different, and I know because I watched it happen in real time. My brother's wife, Vanessa, runs an Instagram account at Vanessa Bishop Style, 11,000 followers, and she documents everything. I found myself checking it obsessively, screenshotting post after post. The same instinct that had made me fold up that note and put it in my pocket instead of throwing it away. Evidence. I didn't fully understand why I was collecting it. I just knew I needed to. December 21st, 2:18 p.m. Vanessa posted a photo of champagne flutes on a hotel breakfast table, the Tagus River glittering behind them through a floor-to-ceiling window. Caption: Lisboa mornings, #blessed, #family first. I looked up the hotel. Four Seasons Ritz Lisbon, $890 a night, 2 rooms, one for my parents, one for Preston, Vanessa, and 4-year-old Beckett. 4 nights in Lisbon, $7,120. While I checked Grandpa's blood pressure twice daily and made sure his pills were split correctly for the week, a new post went up, all 5 of them on a sailboat off the coast near Sintra. My father in navy linen, my mother in white, Preston and Vanessa in matching sand-colored resort wear, Beckett in a tiny orange life vest. Caption: Christmas Eve on the water. Does it get better than this? #the Bishop's Travel. #family goals. I looked up the boat charter. $2,400 for the half day, plus a $600 catering add-on. December 25th, 9:07 a.m. Another post. All of them on a hotel terrace somewhere along the Amalfi Coast. Lemon trees behind them, a spread of pastries on the table. Caption: Christmas morning views you can't put a price on. #Positano, #grateful. You absolutely could put a price on it. And at 11 that night, unable to sleep, sitting on the kitchen floor after finishing Grandpa's laundry and double-checking his medication log, I opened my notes app and did exactly that. I looked up the hotel, La Sierra News, Positano, $1,650 a night, 2 rooms, 3 nights, $9,900. First-class round-trip flights from Denver to Lisbon, connecting home from Athens after Santorini, roughly $9,100 per adult. 3 adults, since Beckett flew as a lap infant fare on most legs, $27,300. Ground transport, private car service between cities, a boat charter to Santorini specifically featured in one of Vanessa's posts, roughly $3,200. Dining, I found 3 separate posts tagged from Michelin-recognized restaurants, and I did a conservative estimate based on published tasting menu prices, averaged across 5 people, adjusting down slightly for Beckett, who at 4 almost certainly wasn't ordering the full tasting menu, approximately $11,400 across the full 10 days. Lisbon Hotel, $7,120. Amalfi Coast Hotel, $9,900. Santorini, 3 nights at a Caldera View suite, averaging $1,200 a night for 2 rooms, $7,200. Flights, $27,300. Boats, cars, transfers, roughly $3,200. Dining, $11,400. Total, $66,120. There was more, too, that I didn't even bother adding to the spreadsheet because by that point, The exact number stopped mattering as much as the pattern of it. Vanessa posted a video, 12 seconds long, of Beckett unwrapping a small box at what she captioned, "An early Christmas surprise from Nona and Papa." A child-sized Rolex, the kind marketed specifically for toddlers, whose parents apparently think a 4-year-old needs to learn to read a $100 watch face before he can read a book. I looked it up out of morbid curiosity. $2,850. My mother had bought her 4-year-old grandson an $1,800 plus timepiece while writing me a note that questioned whether my entire career choice had been a mistake. Another post, this one from my mother's own account, which she rarely used but apparently made an exception for on this trip. A photo of her and my father toasting on a rooftop bar in Positano at golden hour, captioned, "34 years married and somehow still adventuring like newlyweds." 34 years married, and in the 4th year of that marriage they'd had me. And somewhere in the following 3 decades, I had simply stopped registering in her mind as part of the adventure worth documenting. I sat with my laptop open on the kitchen table that night, the little spreadsheet glowing in front of me, columns for date, location, item, estimated cost, source post, and I remember thinking with a strange detached clarity that I wasn't building this for revenge. I didn't fully understand what I was building it for yet. I just knew that some part of me needed the numbers to exist somewhere outside my own head, written down, real, undeniable, in case anyone, including some future version of myself, ever tried to tell me I'd imagined the size of the gap between us. Preston had captioned one early post, "My treat, wanted to do something for everyone after the year we've had." But a later post from Vanessa, tagged #grateful for such generous in-laws, showed my mother and Vanessa clinking wine glasses with the caption, "Mom and Dad wouldn't let us pay for a thing this whole trip." So it wasn't Preston's money after all. It was theirs. $66,120 spent in 10 days, while I ate a $7.49 frozen pot pie alone in that kitchen on Christmas night, sitting on the floor at 11:40 p.m. because I was too tired to sit upright in a chair after doing Grandpa's laundry, checking his blood sugar, making sure the house stayed warm and he stayed fed and safe. December 26th, 8:54 a.m. Another post, a photo from the ferry to Santorini, everyone in white linen, Beckett holding a gelato cone almost bigger than his head. Caption, "Boxing Day boat ride to paradise. Does life get better? #Santorini, #blessed." I stared at that word, blessed, for a long time. My phone buzzed, a text from my mother. "Hi, honey. Hope you and Grandpa are having a nice quiet time. We're in Santorini now, absolutely breathtaking. How's everything?" I typed 4 different responses and deleted all of them before finally sending, "Fine. Grandpa's doing well." Her reply came back in seconds. "Oh, good. We'll be home the 29th. Don't forget his evening meds, XO." Don't forget his evening meds. I am a NICU nurse. I titrate medications by the milligram for infants who weigh less than a bag of flour. I manage feeding tubes, oxygen saturation alarms, and central lines for a living. But my mother, drinking Aperol spritzes on a boat off Santorini, apparently felt it necessary to remind me to remember an elderly man's pills. I screenshotted the text and added it to a folder on my phone labeled simply Evidence. 22 screenshots by that point. Grandpa appeared in the kitchen doorway. I hadn't heard him come down. "Did they ask how you were?" he said quietly. I looked back down at the text. "How's everything?" Everything. Not, "How are you, Carrie?" Not, "Are you holding up okay?" Everything. Which really only meant one thing. Is Grandpa still alive? No, I said. They didn't ask. He nodded once, like he'd expected exactly that answer. They never do. That night I couldn't sleep, again. I lay in that guest room full of Preston's boxes and did more math, the way some people count sheep. My salary, $61,000 a year, came out to roughly $3,900 a month after taxes, about $900 a week. The 10 days I'd been in that house, I'd effectively earned about $1,285 gross, working around the clock, unpaid, because none of it counted as a shift. It was just family helping family. A phrase I was starting to understand meant Carrie helping everyone else for free. Their trip cost $66,120. That was 51.5 times what I would have earned in those same 10 days at my actual job. Put another way, their 10-day vacation cost more than I would earn in 14 months of full-time NICU nursing. Preston made $265,000 a year, which meant that even sitting on a beach doing nothing, using paid time off, he'd earned roughly $7,260 during those same 10 days. I'd earned $1,285 doing round-the-clock, unpaid caregiving. No overtime, no thank you. And my mother had written in her own hand that my nursing career doesn't exactly pay the bills anyway. I thought about Vanessa's captions: blessed, grateful, family goals. I thought about the word successful, underlined so hard in that note the pen had nearly torn through the paper. And I lay there in the dark and thought, define successful. December 27th, 2:03 p.m. The doorbell rang. Grandpa was already dressed and waiting in the great room, in his good gray suit, shoes shined, his thin white hair combed neatly for the first time all week. I opened the door to a woman in her late 50s, sharp navy suit, silver hair pulled back, a leather briefcase in one hand, and kind, tired eyes. Ms. Bishop? I'm Diane Marsh. Your grandfather's expecting me. I let her in. We sat in the formal dining room, the one with the table that never got used, the one reserved for holiday photos, and nothing else. Grandpa at the head, me to his right, Diane across from us, opening her briefcase and pulling out a leather folder thick enough that I could see the individual pages fanned inside it before she even opened it. Walter, she said, I've prepared everything as you requested, the new trust, the amended will, and the letter. Grandpa nodded, then turned to me. Carrie, this is Diane. She's going to walk you through some things. Diane turned to me with a neutral, careful expression, not unkind. Ms. Bishop, your grandfather has asked me to execute significant changes to his estate plan. I want you to take your time reading through this. She slid the documents across the table. I saw my name over and over. Caroline Ann Bishop, beneficiary, trustee, executor. I saw dollar figures with more zeros than I could immediately parse, and I heard her voice explaining it the way you hear something underwater, muffled and slow. If you're still with me, this is the part where the whole story turns, so stay with me, because it only gets more unbelievable from here. And hey, if you haven't already, this is a good moment to hit that subscribe button, because I promise you, the ending of this one is worth sticking around for. Trust value, $31,240,000. My father, Donald Bishop, $250,000. My mother, Marjorie Bishop, $250,000. My brother, Preston Bishop, $250,000. Designated charities, the NICU wing at Denver Health, a scholarship fund in Rifle, a veterans housing nonprofit, $6,500,000. Caroline Ann Bishop, $24,240,000 with full discretionary control over any future distributions to family members. What? I couldn't breathe properly. What? Grandpa reached over and took my hand. His fingers, gnarled from decades of arthritis, closed around mine with surprising strength. They left you here like you were nothing, he said quietly. I'm leaving you everything, so you know exactly how much you are. Diane pulled a sealed cream-colored envelope from the folder, heavy stock paper. Your grandfather has also asked that I be present when the rest of the family returns, to read this letter aloud. They're due back on the 29th, I believe? I nodded, still unable to fully form words. I'll be here at 3 o'clock that afternoon, she said. Grandpa signed in 14 places. Diane witnessed. I witnessed, too, my hands shaking so badly the signature barely looked like my own. The notary stamp read, 2:47 p.m., December 27th, 2024. Legal, binding, irrevocable. We didn't talk much for the rest of that afternoon. Grandpa and I moved through the house quietly, almost gently, like we were both aware something enormous had just shifted underneath us, and neither of us wanted to disturb it too fast. I made dinner. He read the paper. Around 8, he said, You can give them money, Carrie, if you want to. That's entirely your choice now. But the control is yours. They'll have to ask you for it. They'll have to look you in the eye and acknowledge you for once in their lives. What if I say no? Then you say no, he said simply. It's yours to say. I texted Nathan that night. Something huge happened today. Can't explain yet, but I think I'm actually going to be okay. His reply came back within a minute. You've always been okay, Kareen. They just spent 30 years convincing you otherwise. I read that text 5 times before I put my phone down. That night I lay awake again, thinking about 32 years, the pinning ceremony, the birthday spent crying on a bathroom floor, the Thanksgivings I spent alone until Grandpa started coming, the NICU shifts nobody called to ask about, the box in Nathan's closet, the note calling my career a hobby. And I realized, somewhere around 2 a.m, that I didn't actually need forgiveness from any of them anymore. I needed something else. I needed to finally be seen. And tomorrow, whether they wanted it or not, they would see me. My phone buzzed at 9:14 the next morning. A text from my mother. Landed! Home by 2:30 tomorrow. Can't wait to see you both. XO. Grandpa read it over my shoulder without asking. Can't wait to see you, he murmured. She could have called any one of the 10 days we were here. She didn't. Should I warn them about Diane coming? No, he said. Let them walk in exactly the way they always do, expecting nothing to have changed. That morning, before any of it started, I called my closest friend from nursing school, Priya, who'd been my study partner through every brutal clinical rotation and who knew more about my family's dynamics than almost anyone besides Nathan. I sat on the back porch steps in the cold, wrapped in one of Grandpa's old flannel jackets, and told her everything. The note, the trust, the letter, the number with all the zeros I still couldn't quite make my brain fully process. Carrie. She was quiet for a second on the other end of the line. How are you feeling? Actually feeling, not the version you're going to tell your mom later. I thought about it honestly before answering. Guilty, I admitted. Which makes no sense. I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't manipulate anybody. And I still feel like I should be finding some way to fix it, to make it smaller so nobody gets too upset. That's not guilt, Priya said. That's 32 years of training telling you your job is to manage everyone else's feelings before you're allowed to have your own. You've been doing it your whole life, Care. You did it with dying patients' families for 8 years before you ever did it with your own blood family. You don't owe anyone a smaller version of the truth just because the truth makes them uncomfortable. I sat with that for a long moment, the cold seeping up through the porch steps into my legs. What if they never actually change? What if the letters and the therapy are just performance, and in 5 years everything just goes right back to how it was? Then you'll know that too, eventually, she said. But you don't have to solve that today. Today you just have to let the truth get said out loud, one time, in that room, after 32 years of it never once being said. Everything after that is a separate problem for a separate day. I hung up feeling steadier than I had in days, and when Grandpa asked, an hour later, if I was ready, I told him yes. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I actually believed myself when I said it. December 29th. Diane arrived at 2:40, set her briefcase on the coffee table in the great room, and we sat. Grandpa in his usual chair, me on the sofa, Diane in the armchair across from us, the folder open on the table between us like something waiting to detonate. The front door was left unlocked. I remember the strange stillness of those final minutes before they arrived. The house so quiet, I could hear the clock in the hallway ticking. Grandpa's breathing slow and even beside me. Diane flipping once through her folder just to confirm every page was in order. The way a surgeon checks instruments one last time before the first incision. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the house even smelled different than it had 10 days earlier. Like wood smoke and coffee instead of nothing at all. Like it had finally been lived in properly, if only for a little while. 2:58 p.m. I heard car engines outside, 3 of them at once. A Range Rover, a Mercedes GLE, a BMW WX7. Doors slammed. Luggage wheels rattled against the driveway pavers. Laughter carried through the closed front door. My mother's voice, loud and bright. "We're home! Preston! God, I've missed real American coffee." My father somewhere behind her. "Care Bear! Dad!" They came through the door, tan, rested, smiling, dragging suitcases with airline tags still clipped to the handles. Vanessa carried a designer bag I didn't recognize the name of, but could guess the price range of. Beckett clutched a stuffed animal from what I assumed was some overpriced airport shop. They walked into the great room, saw the 3 of us sitting there, saw Diane in her suit with the briefcase and the documents fanned across the coffee table, and their smiles faltered all at once, like a light flickering. My mother looked confused first, then wary. My father's expression sharpened into something suspicious. Preston's eyes narrowed immediately, the way they did whenever he sensed a deal wasn't going his way. "Dad," my father said slowly, stepping into the archway between the foyer and the great room. "What's going on here? Who is this?" Grandpa's voice, when it came, was perfectly still. "Sit down, Donald." My father didn't sit. He stood frozen in the archway, my mother just behind his shoulder, her hand creeping up to her throat the way it always did right before she said something she'd regret. Preston set his suitcase down slowly, his consultant instincts already reading the room, doing his own version of the math I'd been doing for 10 days. "Dad," my father tried again, softer this time, more careful. Seriously, what is this? This, Grandpa said, is Diane Marsh, my attorney. Sit down, all of you. This won't take long, but you're going to hear every word of it. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Vanessa, sensing the temperature in the room, quietly herded Beckett toward the kitchen. "I'll just get him a snack," she murmured and disappeared. And I remember being grateful, at least, that a 4-year-old didn't have to watch what came next. My mother finally spoke, her voice pitched high and bright in that way she used when she was trying to control a situation that had already slipped out of her hands. "Walter, whatever this is, can it wait? We just got off a 9-hour flight. We're exhausted. Sit down, Marjorie." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. They sat, eventually, scattered across the great room like children called into the principal's office. My father in the armchair by the window, my mother perched on the arm of the couch as far from me as the furniture allowed. Preston standing behind them with his arms crossed, still working the angle. Diane cleared her throat. "I'm going to keep this simple. 3 days ago, on December 27th, Walter Bishop executed significant changes to his estate. I'm here to inform you of those changes and, at his request, to read a letter he's written to the 3 of you." "Changes," my father repeated, his voice flat. "What kind of changes?" Diane didn't answer him directly. Instead, she looked at Grandpa. "Walter, would you like me to proceed?" "Read it," he said. She opened the sealed envelope, unfolded 3 pages covered in his slow, deliberate handwriting, and began. "To my son Donald, my daughter-in-law Marjorie, and my grandson Preston. I am 83 years old. I have lived long enough to see exactly who people are when they believe no one is watching." My father's jaw tightened. My mother's hand went back up to her throat. "I built Bishop Ready Mix Concrete from nothing. 1 truck in 1962. I drove that truck myself for 11 years before I could afford a second one. In 2011, I sold the company for $28 million. Donald, you assumed I'd spent most of it. You never once asked me directly. You simply decided, on your own, that your aging father was careless with money, and you quietly began worrying about what would happen when it ran out and I needed help. You believed I had roughly $200,000 left. I let you believe that because I wanted to see who would love me if they thought I had nothing." I glanced at my father. His face had gone the color of ash. "The $28 million is now just over $31 million. I live on about $42,000 a year. The rest I have donated anonymously for 12 years. Scholarships, veterans housing, and 3 years ago, the NICU renovation at Denver Health. None of you ever noticed, because none of you ever asked." My mother was openly crying now, silent tears, her mascara starting to streak. Preston's face had gone through 3 distinct colors in under a minute, red, then a sickly white, then a gray I hadn't seen on a living person before. Diane kept reading, steady and relentless. "For 32 years, I have watched all 3 of you treat my granddaughter like an afterthought. Like hired help you could call on when convenient and dismiss when you no longer needed her. May 14th, 2016. Her nursing pinning ceremony. You flew to Colorado Springs for Preston's job interview instead. You sent her $75 on an app." My mother looked over at me, eyes pleading. I looked back and gave her nothing. No anger, no forgiveness. Just an even, waiting stillness. March 3rd, 2020. Her 28th birthday, in the middle of a pandemic. She called you crying after performing CPR on an infant. You told her you were on a call celebrating Preston's promotion and you would call her back. You never did. You sent her a $20 coffee card. Diane's voice didn't waver even once. Thanksgiving 2022. You flew to Philadelphia for Preston's executive program family weekend and left Carrie completely alone. She invited me to her 490-square-foot apartment instead. She made her first turkey. It came out burned. We ate it anyway, off paper plates, sitting on her pull-out couch because she didn't own a dining table. It was the best Thanksgiving I've had in 30 years, because for once, someone actually wanted me there. My mother pressed a hand over her mouth. I watched something in her face crack open, though I genuinely could not tell in that moment whether it was grief or shame or simply the horror of being caught. This Christmas, you left her a note instead of a phone call. You told her that caregiving might be good practice for her, since nursing doesn't exactly pay the bills. Do any of you understand what she actually does? Carrie is a NICU nurse. She holds the smallest, most fragile lives in this country in her two hands every single day, for people who cannot yet even say thank you. She does this work for $61,000 a year. Diane turned a page. Preston, you help wealthy clients restructure their finances so they pay less in taxes. You make $265,000 a year. You are celebrated for it. She is dismissed for what she does. This trip cost $66,120. I have seen the itemized figures myself, while she checked my blood pressure and made sure I didn't die alone in this house. I have lived long enough to understand one simple truth. Wealth without character is just a more expensive kind of poverty. The three of you are rich. You are also, I'm sorry to say, empty. Preston stood up sharply, his chair scraping backward against the hard wood. This is insane. You can't just... Diane didn't even glance up. She kept reading, her voice never rising, never wavering. Carrie spent 10 days here, not because any of you asked her kindly, but because you assumed she would. Buried the assumption in a passive-aggressive note, and boarded a plane to Portugal. She didn't know I had $31 million. She believed the entire time that I was barely getting by. She stayed anyway. She made me coffee every single morning the way I like it, without ever being told how I take it. She checked my medications like my life actually mattered to her. She sat with me on Christmas Day and never once complained that she was missing her own life, her own boyfriend, her own plans. That is why she gets everything. My eyes were burning by then. I was crying silently, and Grandpa reached over without looking at me and squeezed my hand once, hard. Diane's voice never wavered as she finished. Donald, Marjorie, Preston, you will each receive $250,000. That is more generosity than your treatment of Carrie over the past 3 decades has earned you. If you want more than that, you will have to ask her directly. You will have to apologize to her. You will have to show her, through actions and not words, that you see her as a human being and not a resource to draw on when convenient. She will decide, entirely at her own discretion, whether any of you deserve another dollar beyond that. Not me, her. This is not punishment. This is accountability. This is you finally reaping exactly what you have sown for 32 years. I love all 3 of you, but I will not reward cruelty with a fortune. Signed, Walter James Bishop, December 27th, 2024. Diane folded the letter and set it down on the coffee table. The room went completely silent except for my mother's crying, which had stopped being silent somewhere in the middle of the last page. Then Preston exploded. You cannot do this. This is elder manipulation. It's legal, Diane said, and for the first time her voice sharpened, went colder. It's notarized. It's fully executed. I personally evaluated Mr. Bishop's mental competency before drafting a single page. This will stand up in any Colorado court, and I would advise you not to test that. My mother turned to me, her face twisted between something like rage and something like desperation. You planned this. You manipulated a sick old man into, he's not sick, I said, and I was surprised by how steady my own voice came out. You just assumed he was helpless because he's old. You don't actually know him at all. You never bothered to find out. My father pointed a shaking finger at me. Carrie, you don't understand money. You'll lose all of it inside 5 years. You need our guidance. I understand money just fine, Dad, I said. I just never had any of my own, because you spent mine on Preston's law school networking dinners and told me it was for the family. I watched the truth of that land on his face, and for a second, just a second, I thought I saw something that might have been real shame. Preston turned to Grandpa, his voice cracking now, desperate in a way I genuinely never heard from him. Grandpa, I'll contest this. I'll get lawyers, Diane stood, closed her briefcase with a sharp, decisive click. You can certainly try. Colorado law on testamentary capacity is very clear. Your grandfather is lucid, uncoerced, and acted entirely of his own free will, which I documented extensively. You will lose, and your legal fees will very likely eat into that $250,000 faster than you'd like. I would strongly advise against it. Vanessa reappeared in the doorway with Beckett on her hip, having clearly heard at least the last few minutes of it, her face pale. Preston, baby, maybe we should just— Shut up, Vanessa! Preston snapped, and I watched her flinch. Watched something pass across her face that told me this wasn't the first time. Grandpa stood then, slowly, painfully, using the arm of his chair for leverage, but he stood, straight and steady, and he said the words I know I will remember for the rest of my life. Get out of my house. For a moment, nobody in that room moved. Outside, I could hear the faint tick of the cooling engines in the driveway, the wind picking up against the windows, the fire settling in the hearth. It felt, for just a second, like the whole house itself was holding its breath along with the rest of us, waiting to see which way this would break. My father's face went a deep, dangerous purple. Dad, this is my— No, Grandpa said. It's mine. The deed has always been in my name. I let all of you believe otherwise, so you'd take some responsibility for it. That was my mistake. Get out. They left, not quietly. My mother grabbed her purse from the entry table and turned back at the door, her voice suddenly vicious in a way I'd rarely heard from her. You'll regret this, Isabel. She caught herself. Carrie, you'll regret this. Family is everything. I stood up and looked her directly in the eye. Then why did you treat me like I was nothing for 32 years? She didn't have an answer. She left. Preston stopped in the doorway on his way out, looked back at me over his shoulder. You're going to give us that money eventually. You know you are. You're too weak not to. Something in me went very still, very calm, in a way that surprised me. Try me, I said. 3 cars pulled out of the driveway in quick succession: the Range Rover, the Mercedes, the BMW. Little Beckett waved at me through the back window of the BMW as it pulled away, not understanding at all what had just happened in that house. I waved back at him. He was the only one in that car I didn't blame for anything. The house went quiet. Diane packed up the last of her folder. You'll have full account access within 48 hours, Miss Bishop. My office will walk you through everything, step by step. Congratulations. For what? I asked. She smiled, small but genuine. For being seen. Then she left too, and it was just Grandpa and me again, sitting in the great room the way we had for 10 days straight. Except now, everything about the room, and everything about my life, had permanently changed. We sat in the quiet for a long time after Diane's car pulled away, neither of us saying anything at first. The fire had burned down to embers. Outside, the frozen fountain sat exactly as still as it had the day I arrived, 10 days and an entire lifetime ago. Are you all right? Grandpa finally asked. I thought about it, honestly, before I answered. I don't know yet. I feel like I should be happier than I am. You just watched 32 years get said out loud in one room, he said. That's not happiness. That's more like surgery. The relief comes later, once the wound actually starts to heal, and healing takes longer than people want it to. Do you regret it? I asked him. Any of it? He shook his head slowly, without a moment's hesitation. Not for 1 second. I regret that it took me this long to do something about what I'd been watching for 30 years. I regret that I let you go without protection for as long as I did, when I had the resources the entire time to make sure you never had to feel invisible again. That's my regret, Carrie. Not this. Never this. What happens now? To you, I mean. To this house. I stay here, he said simply. Same as always. I don't need much. I never did. That was rather the point of the last 12 years. He looked at me, something softer in his expression than I'd seen from him even during the warmest moments of the past 10 days. What happens to you now is the more interesting question. You get to decide, for the first time in your entire life, what your own story actually looks like, instead of just reacting to everyone else's. I didn't have an answer for that yet. I still don't think I fully do, even now, months later. But I remember that moment, sitting in that quiet, half-dark room with the fire dying down and my grandfather watching me with something that finally looked like pure, uncomplicated pride, as one of the only times in my adult life I felt something close to peace. My phone started buzzing before Diane's car had even cleared the driveway. A text from my mother. Carrie, we need to talk. This is ridiculous. Call me. I didn't respond. 8:22 p.m., my father. Care, you're making a huge mistake. That money was meant for this family. I deleted it. 10:41 p.m., Preston. Wow, didn't realize you were this petty. Guess all those years around dying patients taught you how to enjoy watching people suffer. I stared at that one for a long time before I screenshotted it and added it to my folder, which by then had grown to something closer to 30 entries. The messages kept coming for days. 7:12 a.m., my mother. Please, I'm your mother. We can fix this. 9:47 a.m., Vanessa, of all people. Hey, Carrie, would love to grab coffee sometime and catch up. No pressure at all. XO. By the end of that first week, I'd counted 51 text messages, 14 phone calls, and 4 emails. One voicemail from my mother, crying, that I saved but never returned. Care Bear, please. I know we haven't been perfect, but we're family. We love you. Please just call me back. Vanessa texted again on January 2nd, this time longer, more careful. I know this isn't my place at all, and you don't owe me anything. But I just wanted to say, what your grandpa wrote about you in that letter, every word of it was true. And I've known it was true since the first Thanksgiving I ever spent with your family and watched how differently everyone treated you versus Preston. I didn't say anything back then. I should have. I'm sorry. I stared at that message for a long while before responding, finally with a simple, "Thank you for saying that." We didn't become close overnight. That took most of the following year, slow and cautious on both sides. But it was the first crack of honesty from inside that family that didn't come with a price tag attached to it, and I noticed the difference immediately. Nathan came over on New Year's Eve. I told him everything, start to finish, sitting on his couch with a blanket wrapped around both of us while the city fireworks went off somewhere in the distance. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. $31 million, he finally said. 24.2 of it, technically. The rest is going to charity. Care. He took my hand. I don't care about the money. I want you to know that right now, before anything else gets weird, I fell in love with you when you were driving a Subaru with a check engine light on. I know, I said, and I did know, with a certainty I hadn't felt about very many things in my life. January 3rd, 2025. My mother showed up at my apartment unannounced, holding a Tupperware container, no makeup on, her eyes swollen in a way I'd genuinely never seen on her before. Carrie, sweetheart, can we talk, just the two of us? I stood in the doorway and didn't invite her in. What do you want, Mom? I brought cookies, your favorite, Snickerdoodles. I looked at the container, then back at her. I'm allergic to cinnamon, Mom. Have been since I was 14. She blinked, genuinely confused. What? You are? You didn't know that. Because you've never once paid attention. Snickerdoodles are Preston's favorite, not mine. I watched the realization land on her face in slow motion. She'd been baking her son's favorite cookies and calling them mine for nearly 20 years without ever once noticing the difference. Carrie, I know we haven't been perfect, but... You haven't been perfect? My voice rose before I could stop it. Mom, you left an elderly man alone in a house with one frozen pot pie. You spent $66,000 in Portugal and Italy while I checked his blood pressure. You missed my pinning ceremony. You told me nursing doesn't exactly pay the bills. You said you'd call me back the night I cried on my bathroom floor after coding an infant, and you never did. We were busy. Preston is 34 years old. When exactly do I get to need something from you? Silence. Then her expression shifted, hardening in a way I recognized instantly, having watched it happen my entire childhood. The tears simply stopped, like a faucet turning off. Her voice went cold and flat. Fine. How much do you want? What? To split it. Evenly. Grandpa obviously meant for the family to share it, not just for you to keep it all to yourself. So name a number. How about we each take a fair share? 5, 6 million, something reasonable, and we all move forward. I stared at her. She genuinely believed this was a negotiation. You think this is about money? I said slowly. Isn't it? No, Mom. This was never about money. This is about 32 years of being completely invisible to you, and you cannot buy your way out of that with a Tupperware container of the wrong cookies. I closed the door. She stood outside for 4 full minutes. I watched through the peephole, waiting to see what she'd do. Eventually, she left. 2 days later, an email arrived from Preston, sent from his work address at Hargrove and Lynn. Subject line, re grandfather's estate. Corrine, I've consulted with estate attorneys at my firm. While Grandpa's will appears legally sound on its face, it raises serious questions about undue influence, given your close proximity to him during his final decision-making period. I'm prepared to avoid formal litigation if you agree to the following. Redistribute the estate to reflect Grandpa's true intent of family unity. 40% to you, 20% each to Mom, Dad, and myself. If you refuse, I will pursue legal action for elder financial exploitation under Colorado revised statutes. Facilities that provide caregiving to the elderly have faced prosecution for far less than this. Think carefully. I forwarded it to Diane at 8:52 a.m. Her reply came back at 9:20. This is an empty threat, and not even a well-constructed one. Save the email. If he actually files anything, we'll use it to demonstrate harassment, and I'll personally flag it to the Colorado Bar's Ethics Board, given his own professional standing. Do not respond directly to him. .dm. I didn't respond. At 8:14 that evening, Preston texted, "Ignoring me won't make this go away." I sent back a single line. "Talk to my attorney, Diane Marsh," along with her office number. His reply came almost instantly. "You have a lawyer now? Are you serious right now?" My father called that same week and left a voicemail, the only one out of dozens I ever listened to all the way through. "Carrie, it's Dad. Look, I know we weren't there for you the way we should have been, but you're my daughter, and A 6-second pause, long enough that I thought the recording had cut out. I need you to do the right thing here. For the family. Not I'm sorry. Not I was wrong. Just I need you to." I deleted it, and I called Diane the next morning. "I want to set up conditions," I told her. "Not a flat refusal. Conditions." "I'm listening." "They each get their $250,000, no changes there. But if any of them want to be considered for anything more from me in the future, they need to do 3 specific things. 1. 12 months of professionally led family therapy, with attendance verification sent to me directly. 2. 50 hours of volunteer work at a hospital or hospice, something hands-on, so they actually see what real caregiving looks like up close. 3. A handwritten letter to me, explaining specifically what they did wrong and what they intend to do differently. I decide, on my own, whether any of it reads as sincere." Diane was quiet for a second. "That's remarkably fair. Generous, even, considering everything." "I'm a nurse," I said. "I believe in second chances. I also believe pretty strongly in accountability. I'll draft the terms and send them by certified mail this afternoon." Before any of that reached them, though, there was a stretch of about 10 days in mid-January that I haven't mentioned yet, because honestly, it still makes my stomach tighten a little to think about, even now. Preston did, in fact, follow through on his threat, at least partway. On January 9th, 2025, Diane called me directly, her voice calm, but carrying an edge of genuine seriousness I hadn't heard from her before. Preston's retained outside counsel, she said. A firm out of Denver called Radcliffe and Voss. They've filed a petition to contest the will on grounds of undue influence and diminished testamentary capacity. I want you to hear this from me before you see anything online, because there's a chance, a small one, that this becomes public record. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. Can they actually win? No, Diane said flatly, without a single trace of hesitation. I want to be very clear with you, Carrie. I've handled contested estates for 26 years. Your grandfather passed a full cognitive competency evaluation with an independent geriatric psychiatrist 11 days before he signed anything, specifically because I insisted on it before I would even draft the documents. I have that evaluation on file. I have video of the entire signing. I have his own handwritten letter in his own hand, explaining his exact reasoning in detail. This isn't a case of an old man being talked into something in a moment of confusion. This is a meticulously documented decision made over a period of days by a man who by every clinical measure was of completely sound mind. Preston's attorneys know this. I strongly suspect this filing is more about pressure than about any real expectation of winning. Pressure to do what? To get you to settle before it ever reaches a courtroom. To make you nervous enough, or tired enough, or embarrassed enough by the process that you offer him money just to make it go away. I thought about that for a long moment, sitting on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, the same spot I'd sat crying on my 28th birthday 5 years earlier. What happens if I don't offer him anything? Then we go to a hearing, Diane said, and I promise you, Carrie, I will enjoy every single minute of it. The hearing was scheduled for late February, though it never actually happened because it never needed to. Radcliffe and Voss withdrew the petition entirely on February 3rd, 5 days before Grandpa died as it happened, though of course none of us knew that timeline was coming. Diane later told me, off the record, that opposing counsel had privately admitted the case had no real legal footing once they'd actually reviewed the full documentation, and that Preston had apparently been the one pushing to file, despite his own lawyer's hesitation. I got exactly one piece of communication about it directly from Preston during those weeks, a text sent at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. You know none of this is really about the money for me. You're supposed to be my sister. I read that message probably a dozen times over the following days, turning it over, trying to find the version of it that made sense, and I never quite did. Because it was hard to square, "You're supposed to be my sister," with a formal legal filing accusing me of manipulating a dying old man. I didn't respond to that one either. Some silences say more than any reply could. They received the certified letter about the conditions within the week. Preston called first. I didn't answer. His voicemail was short and furious. You want us to volunteer and write you letters like we're in some kind of court-ordered program? This is humiliating. I texted back a single line. So was being left alone at Christmas with one frozen pot pie. Your move. An email arrived a few weeks later from a Dr. Renata Ellison, a licensed family therapist in Cherry Creek. Ms. Bishop, per the terms you and Diane Marsh outlined, I can confirm that Marjorie Bishop attended her first individual session on January 14th, 2025, and has since begun joint sessions with her husband. Per confidentiality guidelines, I cannot share session content, but I can confirm she remains fully compliant with the attendance terms you set. I stared at that email for close to 10 minutes. My mother, who had never once in my entire lifetime admitted to being wrong about anything, who had spent 32 years quietly convincing me I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too needy, She was sitting in a therapist's office because I had made it a condition of ever seeing another dollar. Was it real? Or was it just $500,000 worth of performance? I genuinely didn't know yet, and some nights that uncertainty kept me up longer than the estate fight itself ever had. My father enrolled too. A separate confirmation email came from Dr. Ellison's office on January 29th. Preston never did. Instead, a single text arrived from him in early February. Not jumping through hoops for money that should have been mine to begin with. Keep it. I don't need any of you. I typed back one word. Okay. That was the whole reply. I didn't need to convince him of anything. I didn't need to argue or explain or prove I was being reasonable. The choice had always been his to make, and he'd made it. February 8th, 2025, 4:22 in the morning. My phone rang, and it was Grandpa's number, but it wasn't Grandpa's voice on the other end. It was a 911 dispatcher. The paramedics had used his phone to reach his emergency contact, which, as of 3 months earlier, was me. I drove to the house in under 15 minutes, breaking every posted speed limit the entire way, my hand shaking so badly on the wheel that I had to grip it hard enough to hurt. The ambulance was still in the driveway when I arrived, lights off, and I knew, before I even got out of the car, what that meant. Nobody rushes for a call that's already over. Inside, Grandpa was in his wingback chair by the bay window, eyes closed, his expression completely peaceful, like he'd simply drifted off mid-thought. A paramedic in her 40s looked at me with the kind of practiced, professional gentleness I'd used myself hundreds of times on other people's families. I'm sorry. He was gone before we got here. Looks like his heart, most likely quick. We don't think he suffered. I sat down beside him and took his hand. It was still warm. Can I have a minute? I asked. And they gave it to me, stepping out onto the porch. I did what I had done for countless patients over 8 years of nursing. Closed his eyes gently, smoothed his hair back, whispered, "You're okay now. You did good." But before that, I leaned in close to his ear and whispered something only for him. "Thank you," I said, "for seeing me. For proving I wasn't imagining any of it. For giving me justice when nobody else would." And I know it's impossible. I know he was already gone by then. But I would swear on anything you asked me to that his hand squeezed mine, once, right at the end. The ash spreading was small, exactly the way he'd planned it in advance with Diane months earlier. No funeral service, cremation only, ashes scattered in the small vegetable garden behind the house, where he'd grown tomatoes every summer for close to 40 years. My father came. My mother came. Preston came, though he stood apart from everyone else the entire time, arms crossed, saying nothing to anybody. I scattered Grandpa's ashes myself, around the roots of the dormant tomato plants he'd kept alive season after season for nearly 4 decades. Afterward, my mother approached me at the edge of the garden. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for everything." I looked at her, really looked, the way you look at someone when you're finally done performing politeness for their comfort. "Are you sorry you did it?" I asked. "Or sorry you got caught?" Tears spilled down her face. I don't know yet, honestly." "When you figure it out," I said, "put it in your letter." She nodded and walked away, and I stood alone in that garden for a long time after everyone had left. The tomato plants were bare and dormant in the February cold, but I knew, standing there, that they weren't dead. They were just waiting for spring, the way I supposed I had been too, for most of my life, without quite realizing it. 6 months later, in August of 2025, my mother and father had attended 22 therapy sessions between the two of them. My father had logged 31 hours volunteering at Denver Health's hospice unit, the same hospital wing Grandpa had quietly funded years earlier without ever telling anyone. He cried there twice, according to the coordinator who eventually reached out to confirm his hours for me. Once when a patient reminded him sharply of his own father. Once when he watched a daughter sit vigil at her mother's bedside for 3 straight days and realized out loud in front of a stranger that he had never once done anything like that for anyone in his entire life. My mother wrote me a letter, 4 pages, handwritten, no typed draft, no copy kept for her own records, which Diane confirmed for me since I'd asked, oddly needing to know that detail before I'd even opened the envelope. I read it standing in my own kitchen, the same way I'd once stood in hers, reading a very different kind of note. She wrote about the science fair, the one I hadn't even brought up to her directly, which meant she'd been sitting with her own memory of it, independent of anything I'd said. She wrote that she remembered coming home that night and seeing my volcano still sitting on the counter, untouched, the food coloring dried into the paper mache, and that some small part of her had known, even then, that she'd missed something that mattered and had simply decided it was easier to feel guilty quietly than to change anything about the pattern going forward. She wrote about my pinning ceremony, admitting she'd genuinely convinced herself in the moment that Preston's deposition trip was the more urgent obligation, and that it wasn't until she read Grandpa's letter aloud in her own head, weeks later, alone, that she understood how thin that justification had always been. She wrote, near the end, "I don't expect you to forgive me on any kind of schedule, and I promise I will never again treat your forgiveness like something I'm owed just because I finally showed up in a therapist's office. I just want you to know, I finally see the shape of what I did, all 32 years of it, laid out end to end, and it is worse than I let myself believe while I was doing it." The last line read, "I'm not ready to forgive myself yet, but I'm trying to be someone worth forgiving. I'm reading everything you sent back to me, every single word, more than once. I'm not ready to fully trust it, but I read it more than once too. Preston never enrolled in therapy, never volunteered a single hour, never wrote a letter. His $250,000 is gone. He bought a boat with most of it, according to Vanessa, who reached out to me quietly in the spring, separately from him, just to talk. We don't speak, Preston and I. I don't know if we ever will again. And for the first time in my life, I've made peace with the possibility that we might not. I donated $4.5 million, exactly as the original letter had specified, split between the NICU expansion project at Denver Health, a scholarship fund for kids in Rifle where Grandpa grew up, and a veterans housing initiative he'd quietly supported for over a decade. The NICU wing broke ground in June. Premature infants who might otherwise have been transferred hours away to bigger facilities will now get to stay close to their families, in rooms Grandpa's money helped build, cared for by nurses who will never know his name. I went to the groundbreaking myself in June, in my scrubs, straight off a 12-hour shift, because I hadn't wanted to make a whole event out of changing clothes for it. The hospital's chief of neonatology, Dr. Adeyemi, a woman who'd trained half the nurses on my unit at one point or another over the years, pulled me aside afterward, away from the small crowd of administrators and donors in nicer clothes than mine. "Do you know how many transfers we've had to send out of state in the last 5 years?" she asked me. "Families driving 4-5 hours each way to visit their own newborns because we didn't have the bed capacity here. This wing means 40 of those families a year get to stay close, get to be in the room. get to hold their baby's hand instead of watching it happen through a grainy video call from 300 miles away. She looked at me for a long moment. Your grandfather funded the last renovation too, you know. Anonymously back in 2022. I only found out it was him after he passed, when the estate paperwork crossed my desk. I wish I'd known while he was alive. I would have liked to shake that man's hand myself. He would have hated that, I told her, and I meant it. He didn't do any of it to be thanked. No, she agreed. The best ones rarely do. She squeezed my arm once before walking off toward the small gathering, and I stood there a moment longer, in my scrubs, in the June sun, thinking about a shoebox of old photographs and a nurse in rifle, whose last name Grandpa never learned, and about how some kindnesses just keep traveling forward, long after the person who started them is gone. I kept the rest, invested conservatively, exactly the way he would have wanted. I cut back my hours at the hospital, but didn't quit entirely. I still work 3 shifts a week in the NICU, because I genuinely love the work, and because some part of me needed to prove, mostly to myself, that the money didn't change what I actually valued. I own my apartment now instead of renting it. Nathan proposed for real on June 21st at the Sculpture Park in Loveland, string lights and all, exactly as he'd been planning since before that Christmas even started. I said yes before he finished the sentence. The money never changed who I was. What it changed was my belief that I was less than the people around me, that I had to keep waiting patiently to finally be seen. I started my own therapy that spring too, something I want to be honest about, because it would be dishonest to tell you this whole story like I walked out of that great room in December, completely whole and unbothered. I saw a therapist named Marcus every other week starting in March, not because any court order or family agreement required it of me, but because I noticed sometime in February that I was still flinching every time my phone lit up with a family member's name, still bracing for the note, the dismissal, the small cruelty dressed up as practicality. 32 years doesn't just wash off because a will got rewritten and a letter got read out loud in one dramatic afternoon. Marcus asked me in one of our early sessions whether I felt like the money had actually fixed anything. I remember sitting with that question for the full length of our silence before I answered. It didn't fix anything, I told him eventually. It just finally gave the truth somewhere to land. I think I would have needed the truth said out loud even if there'd been no money attached to it at all. The money just happened to be the vehicle Grandpa had available to make sure people actually listened. Do you think they would have listened without it? He asked. I thought about my mother's cold, instant pivot to negotiation the day she showed up with the wrong cookies. I thought about Preston's texts, his lawsuit, his $250,000 spent on a boat instead of on a single hour of the accountability that had been offered to him for free. No, I said finally. I don't think they would have. And that's the part that still hurts more than any of the rest of it. Not that they didn't show up for 32 years. That it took $31 million to make some of them finally consider showing up at all. Marcus didn't try to talk me out of that feeling, which I appreciated more than almost anything else he ever said to me over that year. He just let it sit in the room, the way Grandpa used to let hard truths sit by the fire without rushing to soften them. I want to tell you about the wedding because I think Grandpa would have wanted me to, and because it feels like the right place to actually close this out. Nathan and I got married on October 4th, 2025, at a small venue outside Boulder, the kind of place with a barn and string lights and about 70 chairs, because I didn't want anything bigger than that. My mother came. She sat in the second row, not the front, because I asked her to, gently, and she didn't argue about it, which surprised me more than almost anything else that had happened over the previous year. My father walked me partway down the aisle. I'd asked Diane, of all people, to walk the other half with me. A decision that confused exactly nobody who had lived through the previous 10 months with me, and one my father accepted without complaint, which was its own kind of small, quiet miracle. Preston was not there. He was invited. He didn't respond to the invitation at all, not even a decline, which told me everything I still needed to know. I kept one seat empty in the front row, on the aisle, with a single carnation resting on it. The grocery store kind, $9.99, the price tag left on. Nobody at that wedding needed it explained to them. Everyone who mattered already knew exactly whose seat it was. By the time the wedding happened, my mother had completed her full 12 months of therapy and had, on her own initiative, extended it another 6 beyond what the original terms required. My father had logged just over 90 hours at the hospice unit by then, well past his original 50, and had started going in on Saturdays even without being asked to, according to the volunteer coordinator who still occasionally emails me updates I never requested, but have come to quietly look forward to. He told me once, at the wedding reception, standing awkwardly by the dessert table with a glass of sparkling cider in his hand, because he'd apparently also stopped drinking sometime that spring, that volunteering at that hospice was the first thing in his entire adult life that had made him feel like less of a failure as a father, rather than more of one. I didn't know what to do with that sentence. I still don't, fully. But I believed he meant it. My mother gave a short toast at the reception. 3 sentences, no more, because I'd asked her ahead of time to keep it brief, and she'd actually listened. I wasn't the mother Carrie deserved for most of her life, she said, her voice shaking only slightly. I'm trying every single day to be one now. Thank you for letting me keep trying. It wasn't a grand speech. It didn't erase 32 years in 90 seconds, and I don't think either of us expected it to. But it was honest, and after a lifetime of performance, honest was the only currency I actually cared about anymore. Preston's marriage to Vanessa ended in April of that year, quietly. No public announcement, just a mutual friend mentioning it to me in passing at a baby shower. Vanessa and I have coffee now, every month or so, without Preston anywhere in the conversation. She's rebuilding something for herself and for Beckett, and I help where I can. Not with money exactly, since she's never once asked me for any, but with the kind of ordinary showing up that apparently nobody in that family had ever bothered to model for either of us. Beckett is 5 now. He still doesn't fully understand what happened that Christmas. Someday, if he ever asks, I'll tell him the truth, in whatever version a 5-year-old, and then a 15-year-old, and then eventually a grown man can actually hold. The tomato plants in Grandpa's garden came back that spring, exactly the way I somehow knew they would, right on schedule, the same variety he'd planted every year for close to 40 years. I drove out there in early June, alone, and knelt down in the dirt in my work clothes and picked the first ripe one straight off the vine and ate it right there, standing in that yard, the way he used to describe doing when he was young and broke and building something out of nothing with his own 2 hands. It tasted like a summer I never actually got to have with him, and also, somehow, exactly like one I did. My name is Caroline Ann Bishop. I'm 32 years old. I'm a NICU nurse, and for the first time in my entire life, I finally understand what successful actually means. It was never about the number in an account. It was about someone, somewhere, finally choosing to see me exactly as I was without needing anything back in return. I think about that empty guest room full of Preston's boxes sometimes. Still, even now, a year and a half later, married, settled, standing in a kitchen that's fully mine. I think about the version of me who sat on that pull-out couch eating a burned turkey off paper plates and calling it the saddest Thanksgiving of her life, not yet knowing it would turn out to be the one that mattered most. I think about a shoebox of photographs and a nurse in rifle whose name got lost to time, and a man who spent 12 quiet years giving away a fortune just to find out, once and for all, who would love him without it. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe because there are more like it coming. And tell me in the comments, has anyone in your own family ever made you feel like the backup plan, the afterthought, the one who gets called when everyone else is unavailable? I read every single comment, and I promise you, you are not alone in this. Sometimes the people who are supposed to see us clearest are the last ones to actually look. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, there's still someone in your corner quietly keeping score on your behalf, waiting for the right moment to finally make sure the whole room hears the truth.